Welcome to Creative Tian channel. Today I'm going to show you how to do a transfer tool bind off on an LK150 knitting machine. There are many different ways of bind off, but this is the one I like most, and there are several variations of the transfer tool bind off. First, I need some plain stockinette stitches, and now I'm ready to bind off. To bind off, I usually take the yarn off the carriage so you can adjust the tension. Now you have your transferring tool, and because our yarn is on the right side, I will go from right to the left side. But if your yarn is on the left, you can do it from left to right. You can push out the needle a little bit so you can see the stitches better. And a very common way people do is to just transfer the first stitch to the second, like that. And then move the stitches behind the ledge and place the yarn inside the ledge and pull back. So it's kind of like hand knitting the stitch. And you can continue doing that. Move the stitch to the next stitch. Push out the needle so both yarns are behind the ledge. And you just place the new yarn inside the ledge and then pull back so the ledge is closed. And we'll continue doing that for a few more stitches. Move to the next needle, push down, place the yarn in the hook, pull back. This is not the best way to do it, but it's workable. The problem with this bind off is very hard to control the tension, so it might be uneven or getting too tight. And also this bind off will create some holes. I will show you after I'm done. Here is a cast off edge on the top. You can see it tends to get tight. It's difficult to make it even. You can see it creates a lot of bigger holes. Here is the back side. So that's not the ideal cast off method, but I just want to show it because it's very common. But there is an improved version of the transfer tool bind off. So instead of transfer the first stitch to the second, we transfer the second stitch to the first. I'll push out needle a little bit so you can see it. So we transfer the second stitch and move it to the first stitch. Place it in the ledge. And now we have choice. We can transfer this stitch back to the second stitch, or we can just knit directly on the first stitch. We push the needle out so those two yarns are behind the ledge, and place the new stitch inside the ledge and pull the needle back so we are hand knitting this stitch. And after we are done, we can place this stitch back to the second needle, and we'll repeat that. Start by transferring the second stitch to the first needle, and we can push this out so the stitches are behind the ledge, and place a new yarn in the ledge and pull back. And now we transfer this stitch to the second needle, that's the empty needle. And we'll keep doing that. transfer back to the second stitch. And start again from the second stitch, transfer to the first stitch, push needle out, place a new yarn in and knit back. And now transfer this stitch back to the second needle. And we'll just keep repeating that. And there's another method that's similar but slightly different. We still start with the second stitch, transfer to the first stitch. And now instead of placing the new yarn in the ledge, we'll transfer this stitch back to the second stitch. Push the needle out, place a yarn in, and knit the stitch back. So we do the transfer first, and then knit the stitch later. Second needle, transfer to the first stitch. And now we transfer these two yarns back to the second needle. Push the needle out, place a yarn in, and then knit back. The second needle, transfer to the first. Now transfer the stitches back to the second needle. Knit back. Second stitch, back to the first. And now move it back to the second. Knit it. Now you can see the back side. This is the part we transfer the first stitch back to the second first before we knit. And on the right side, the first half, we knit first on the first needle and then transfer it back to the second needle. So it looks pretty similar. The tension is a little bit tight, otherwise you don't see the holes. Compare with the first one. We didn't move from the second stitch to the first, so you can see the holes. There's no obvious holes in the improved bind-off, but the tension is still hard to control. It gets a little tight. So we are going to try another variation of the transfer tool bind-off. Now here is my third sample of the stockinette stitches. And we are going to try to control the tension. We are going to start by transferring the second stitch back to the first stitch. And then move the stitch back to the second stitch. So the first stitch is empty now. We push it out, and we also push out the second needle. Now we are going to have the new yarn over both needles and place it in the ledge of the second needle and knit back. So there's a loop on the first needle. That way we can keep the tension even. And then we'll repeat that. We move the second stitch to the first one. And then transfer it back to the second stitch. And move up the empty needle and the needle we just worked. And then place a yarn under both needles and go over both needles. And place it inside the ledge and knit it back. And we will continue repeating that. The second stitch, transfer to the first one. And then move it back to the second stitch. And now we will have an empty needle here. Push it all the way out to the D position and push this needle all the way out so the yarn is behind the latch. And then place the new yarn over 2 needles and place in the latch of the last needle and knit. Now again, the second stitch, back to the first stitch, and then we will move both yarns back to the second needle. Place the needle all the way out and place the empty needle out and have the yarn go over both and knit it back. The second needle transfer to the first one and then transfer both yarn back to the second needle. And move the needle all the way out and the empty needle out. Place the new yarn over 2 needles and knit it back. Back to the second needle. Over the 2 needles and knit back. So this is the last bind off we just did. It has a chain stitch edge. It still have some holes, but the stitches are very even. Because there's no gauge peg on LK150 knitting machine, so this is a good way to make the tension even by wrapping over 2 needles. It might be more work, but the result is worth it. This is the first one. You can see we have bigger holes. Still the pretty tight bind off. That's the first one. This is the second one. You don't see the holes that obviously, but it's hard to control the tension. And this is the third one with the chain stitch. The tension is pretty even. So that's the variation of doing the transfer tool bind off. I hope you find it useful. Thank you for watching and see you next week.